everybody. No mic. Hello, everybody. Can I ask you all to take your seats, please? We're about to rush into the next session, which is to say, how do you come back from a session like we've just seen? What an extraordinary series of presentations, and congratulations to Lars for ensuring that this significant and important piece was on the agenda for us to actually discuss. I'm Daryl Karp. I'm the director of the Australian National Maritime Museum, and I just wanted to welcome you to this plenary where we continue on that theme of museum as activist, or perhaps we should extend it to critical agents of change, more in line with the conversations of the past few days, where we set out to challenge, inspire, influence, open eyes, connect, and of course, engage. You're in for a treat, not nearly as powerful, or maybe I'm preempting what my speakers are about to say, but we're in for a treat today with three terrific speakers from around the globe. Laura Boon-Williams from the United Kingdom, Andrea Conceição from Portugal, and to start our session, Peter Armstrong from the USA. Peter is president and CEO of Mystic Seaport Museum in Connecticut, and brings 30 years of museum experience, including leading Jamestown Yorktown Foundation in Virginia and the United Kingdom's National Museums of Arms and Armour, which includes the Tower of London. He has lectured across the globe on the theme of museums as agents of social change, and today we'll hear from him on the findings of their strategic planning program and their vision for their centenary at Mystic Seaport in 5 years' time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really humbled and really feel very privileged after the last presentation. So I'm going to speak to you today and try to lighten the mood a little bit, if we can do that before we move on. I've been asked to obviously fit this into 15 minutes and to speak slowly, so let's see how that goes. I want to thank you all for still being here on the Friday morning. I want to thank ICMM for the organisation of this conference and for the three Lowland museums for their hospitality. I also want to thank Greenwich Maritime Museum for fitting the rest of us in. So it's very good of them. So it's the last day, so I'm going to try and keep it light if I possibly can. We all know that people recall stories more effectively, so let's talk about chocolate cake. When the museums are making chocolate cake for their visitors, imagine a museum is making that chocolate cake, and it has to put in the right amount of objects, the right amount of interpretation, the right amount of history, images, etc., and then it presents it to the visitors who say, I don't really like chocolate cake. And that's one of the issues that we have. Please remember this story as we go through. This is Mystic Seaport, not on a day when we have sea level rise, but on a day when we are having a fire, an event to do with firefighters. It's 19 acres, or 77,000 square meters, of our Dutch friends and the holders of the 2024 men's gold medal, 158 field hockey pitches. It's big. It has a number of buildings, not this one, but some of them in this repair. It has a lot of maintenance to do. It has over 600 boats out of the water, and about 50 boats in the water. We have about 160 staff, millions of objects, apparently a set of water skis and a swordfish bone for some particular reason, I'm not sure why. Even more archives. And if you put all this together, you get the largest, unless you count Howard's Park, the largest maritime museum in America, telling hundreds of stories, showing thousands of objects. And you have to ask yourself, and we asked ourselves, why are we bothering? Why bother? What's the point? Why do we have the museum as a whole in where it currently is, collecting these objects? That's a question we wanted to ask ourselves from the very beginning. So, a little bit of a quiz to lighten the mood. How heavy is the Charles W. Morgan? I'll take a guess. Anybody want to guess how heavy the Charles W. Morgan is? Who shouted out first? Here you go. There's a hat. Don't lose an eye. There you go. It's actually 351 tons. You know, a ton off. Never mind. But if I turned off the lights, that would not only just be weird, but also allow you to Google and get 351 tons. We find ourselves today We're knowing about the hows and the whens and the whos very easily just by the phone that's in our hands. But it's the why that is very important. And that's what Daryl said on the first day. You've got to find the why. The actual quote is from a marketing quote which says, "Find the why, girl, and fly, fly, fly." So find that why is really important. And so the museum at the Seaport has to ask itself, if the magical place didn't exist tomorrow, who would care? We asked ourselves that question as we started our strategic planning. What is our impact? What difference are we making to the outside world with our museum? And it's not just one community we're talking about. Often in these phrases, people talk about, what impact are we having on our visitors? But obviously, from the conversations we've had over the last few days, and in fact, forgive me, Sally, for actually changing this PowerPoint yesterday and sending it to you. Thank you very much for being able to put that on the system. And changed my whole speech yesterday because of all the great things we've heard over the last 4 days. The community isn't just about the visitors. It's about the maritime community, and we couldn't have seen a better example than that in the last two speakers. It's about the maritime community. It's about the community we exist, the national community, the international community. What are we doing, and what is our impact? When you consider that our museum spends a lot of time talking about this, the America's Cup, when actually we know that 82% of our museum visitors that we asked, of the 100 that we asked, believed that this is the America's Cup. So you have to ask yourself, are you really having an impact? And we set out to try and do that by what we call charting our course. So this is lots of graphs, and we're going to run through them really quickly because, the day's moving along. But we have our mission, our 5 areas of focus. We had lots of meetings, because God knows what we're going to do if we didn't have loads of meetings every single day. What else could we do? And then we said, well, where can we make a difference? What are the things that we're particularly good at? What do we have? What are our 5 areas of focus? We know we have the shipyard and the preservation of ships. We know we have learning and scholarship and research. We have the collection itself. We have the visitor experience. And we have our location, 5 things that kind of we felt were the leading things that we could actually offer. And then we got into the 5 R's. This is where we try to control what we're doing, what decisions we're making, and why we're making those decisions. This was incredibly useful to us. The 5 R's are the first one, which I can never pronounce, reciprocity. So that is all of us working together. Is it really part of our own program? What is our relevance? What's the reputation? What's the responsibility? And what's the revenue? So this is, if we're going to take a boat in, if we're going to do a project, we're going to do an exhibition, is everybody involved in it? Is it relevant to what we're doing as a museum? Does it enhance our reputation? Is it our responsibility to do it? And does it either generate revenue? Of course it doesn't. So does it also, but what does it actually cost? So we actually know the cost as well as what the revenue may be, rather than just plowing on with it. And then we looked at trying to keep ourselves straight and keep ourselves honest by ensuring that we were convening, connecting, and curating. This is quite important, I think, for museums because we often think we're better than we are. And actually, our real role is to maybe just bring people together rather than actually make a chocolate cake, which is what I talked to you about at the beginning. Be human-centric, make sure it's based around people, the stories that we're telling, and the way that we're working. Celebrate and enrich the place of Mystic because we're there on the river and we should use that river as much as possible. Be national in our scope so that whatever we do is seen to be of a national significance. And be climate focused. Mystic Seaport, I showed you there with all that water pouring out, and I jokingly spoke about a little bit about the fact that it was floods. Well, it floods about 10 times a year now. And it used to flood about 2 times a year. But now it floods 10 times a year and takes up nearly 3/4 of that site is underwater in some days. So it's a big issue for us to deal with. How do we deal with climate change as we go forward with our strategy? To build on excellence as well, I forgot that one. I'll just build on that as well then. And we came to the conclusion that the maritime experience matters. That what we're doing with the maritime experience matters to people's lives. And we really had to make sure that anything we did ensured that that maritime experience, whatever that was, mattered to them and we could make a difference with it. But, remember the chocolate cake. We spend a great deal of time talking about all the great things that maritime experiences can bring to people. the feelings and the emotions, the history and the sheer awe of the sea. And we've spoken about this all at this conference. But then just what if they're not interested? What if they don't like chocolate? What if they don't really care? We've been talking a lot about the sea and what it means to people. All the stories that we have, all the objects that we have, what does it mean to people? But maybe we need to consider people and what the sea means to them, and actually understand where they're coming from before we consider what we produce. So here's 3 just examples of what we're doing at the moment. You can see there that on the left-hand side, we have a thing called the Center for Experiential Education. So when I first came, I watched all have this. A large number bus comes with 40 children on it. 40 children get off, scream for 2 hours, get back on, and go back to school, and get very little out of it. So what are we doing that actually makes a difference to young people's lives? So we have the Center for Experiential Education. This is a center where we work with young people for about 3 years. And during that 3 years, we take young people who have either rejected or been rejected from school and work with them over the 3-year period to help them find their sea story. We work with the blue economy, you can see a picture here, with like-minded industries and try to help them to find their sea story, to communicate and work together about what they're trying to do in the sea. And we develop exhibitions like our award-winning Entwined exhibition, as you can see here, which after 3 years of building partnerships, we asked the question, what would the maritime history of New England look like if it had been written by the indigenous and African communities rather than by us? And what was their sea story, and how can we tell their sea story rather than ours? And we're looking for other ways to tell stories as well for the individuals, for those sea stories. I think I click it and it starts, right?
I saw a picture of what I later came to find out was my great-grandfather. So when I saw the picture, I kind of did a double take and got chills, because it was a picture of a man that looked like every man on my mother's side of the family. And it simply said, boat steerer, bark wanderer, 1921.
So that was just a short clip of a sea story that we created to go onto YouTube, and we'll talk about that in a second. But really, has it worked is the question as we started to ask people, what is your sea story? What is your connection? How can we help you find that sea story? Well, sometimes it has, a bit. Sometimes it's worked well, and sometimes it's worked quite spectacularly. So let's just look at our YouTube program when we started this sea story program last year. This is Find Your Sea Story. Here's all the kind of uses of it in the marketing, etc. Here's all the marketing that we did to make sure. Oh, there's a magazine on the left-hand side, and I've got some copies that I'm going to leave outside you can have a look at. It's all full of those sea stories as well. But this is our Find Your Sea Story YouTube views since we started it. 223, in 2023, the views were 59,915. In 2024, there's 699,000 when we start the Sea Story program. That's a something ridiculous percentage, which we used obviously to get funding, but doesn't really exist. But you can see here what the Sea Story's contents were prior to here, where the numbers were for the 60,000. Very much ranged around the stories we were telling them about navigation, about Viking ships, etc. And then when the stories started talking about people and individuals, you can see those numbers leapt up when individuals were talking about their sea story and their individual sea story. And then here's a real interesting figures. You can see that in 2023, 55% of our visitors to the YouTube were 65 and plus. Now, 65 and plus, we're at 13%, and now we've grown in the 35-year-olds to the 25-year-olds. So much more of an interest to those particular individuals as we go forward. And now when we say to ourselves, if we close tomorrow, who would care? Then maybe these individuals would care. Individuals that know they have a connection to the museum, know that they have a sea story, know that they've got some reason for coming, some reason to be involved in some way. And we believe the maritime experience matters when the individual makes that connection to the sea, because we think that it's about the individual and their story, not necessarily about the story that we want to present to them. So we no longer want to be showing objects that don't connect to the individual. We believe we want no more special exhibitions that tell the public what we think they should know and be interested in. No special projects that make us feel good and sound good to you guys, but not necessarily what our community requires. We serve the community in which we exist, the local maritime community, the local mystic community, the national community, the international maritime community, and we need to have your help in that as well. So I'm asking you guys to think about how we could partner with ourselves and work towards delivering that message. Not just keepers of history, but active participants within it. We believe we all need to be agents of social change. And that's quite a heavy stuff, I know. So really, have a safe trip home, enjoy the rest of your day, and eat as much chocolate cake as possible. Thank you. I also forgot the plug for the main sheet newspaper we got here and our magazine. So there's a plug going to be, and we'll be talking to you about that later. Sorry, Daryl, I had to get the plug in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Our next speaker is Andrea Conceição, and she's the director of the Sesimbra Maritime Museum, an archaeologist with a master's degree in nautical history and naval archaeology, and she's also a PhD student in Socio-museology at the Universidade Nova de Lisboa with a scholarship from the UNESCO chair. In 2019, the museum began to design activities that involved community with participatory and collaborative programs and started delivering real impacts. Can you welcome Andrea, please?
Good morning, all. First of all, thank you so much to ICMM for letting me present the work of a small maritime museum in Portugal, 35 kilometers of Lisbon, and talk about the impact of the work that we are trying to have among our communities. Sesimbra is a small village with less than 5,000 inhabitants near Lisbon, and it's, at least in my perspective, a beautiful bay. That's why we have so many tourists. Our museum is hosted inside the fort of the 17th century. You can see on the right of the picture, and the fort has 200,000 visitors a year. The museum has about 30,000 visitors a year. And so our collection was donated by the fishermen community. They started donating in 1981 because they wanted to have a museum that represented them. The municipality at the time didn't have a proper space to have a museum, but they started collecting and storing all the objects mainly about ethnography. We have at our collections archaeology, of course, and we have one of the oldest copper fishing hooks in Europe with 5,000 years old. That's where our story begins. And we have so many objects. We have more than 10,000 objects in our collections, but in 2019 we start asking to ourselves, what is an object without a narrative? And so we went to talk to our community and ask them for share the narratives of the objects of our collections. And people start participating actively in the story of the museum. Not only by sharing those objects, because those objects are objects from our families. I can talk in the first person because my grandfather, my father, my mother, my great-grandmother, they were donators of the museum. And people start talking not only about the objects they had given to the museum, but also about stories of other people. and they start sharing not the stories of the objects, but their own personal stories about the community, about maritime life, about other aspects of Sesimbra story and cultural identity. And so we ask people in a second level to participate in the maintenance and the conservation of our objects. And when they were participating at the process, they shared as well stories about those objects. Our main point is, when you participate actively in the life of the museums, you are in charge as well. And when you are in charge as well, you can have not only responsibility, but you give suggestions, and we have a common heritage and a shared heritage. And so all those narratives were really important and helpful, because the community start participating and working in our department activities, not only with the students, but with other members of our communities. And then we asked them, can you be at the museum and share with our visitors, with other people, that ancestral knowledge about fisheries and about our collections? And people just start coming. And from this point, people from the community start participating in other type of activities. We have a project with Norwegian Maritime Museum and with the Tromsø University in Norway in the Arctic. And this April, we asked them if they could bring the robots, because our community, we have many fishermen, but in fact, they have never seen the bottom of the sea, of the ocean. And this man in the picture is Mr. Arthur. He has 94 years old. He's a fisherman. He's a donator of the museum as well, and he has never seen the bottom of the ocean. And this robot with the cell phone, people could actually drive the robot in real time and see the bottom of the ocean. And they were just amazed. And we asked them to participate in other collaborative activities, such like art creation, with the children and the different persons that, in fact, are the community of our museum. And this work has been going on. And we start working last year in an exhibition with the Arctic University of Norway called Living with the Ocean. And we ask people, how is your perspective of living with the ocean? And so we gather so many people, so many different members of our community, not only from Sesimbra, but from Norway as well, from the university. And so people gave their contribute about how is to live with the ocean, and how your perspective the future at the coast. Because we was told a few minutes ago, Orwell wrote that when we own the past, we own the future as well, or we control the future as well. So I think that museum role is to help people not to control, but to prepare the future, and we need to prepare the memories and the collections that we have for that we want for the future. And when I talk about collections, not only about objects, but the narratives about those objects. And so we keep working, and we prepared an exhibition called People of Sesimbra. We went to the archive, collect a few photographies, mainly about women, and we gathered the community and asked, do you know who these women are, and the stories that are behind those images? That lady, Mrs. Louisa, she is one of the girls of the image. And when she was 10, she earned a scholarship because she was a really good student, but because she was a woman, her father didn't let her keep studying. And we think those type of stories need to be told and to be preserved for the future in order they don't happen again. And so, because we want that community share not only the stories and not talk only about the objects of our collections, we are going to host the 29th Forum of the Mediterranean Maritime Museums, and our topic will be maritime museums and maritime communities, and our community will participate as well at the conference, because we think that as inviting people that are not academics, that are not used to speak in public and to have this contact with the scientific knowledge is very important. The life of our museums depends if we share all the types of the communities of the museum share this heritage in different perspectives. That's why we invited our community to participate at the conference. And because we had so many stories, so many narratives, so many people participating at the museum activities, we decided to have and to hire a professional theater company with professional actors and open a call to the community so we can prepare another collaborative process, another collaborative project about putting all those stories, all those memories in the streets for everyone. So we open a call for local actors. People just say yes and join the project. And so we started collecting memories, personal documents, personal pictures. This image in particular is from the middle of 20th century, from poor girls that used to work in the fish cannon factories. And we were not aware who these women were. These were poor women, but with a face, but without a name, without a narrative. And so we put these women on the streets. We collect those stories. Now we have names, we have narratives, we have numbers. We know that they were really poor, and they start working in the factory when they were around 10 or 12 years old. We have really sad stories, and when they get married, the husbands just didn't want them to work anymore, so they had to quit. And those stories are on our streets, not only in image, but with local actors that tell anyone that pass on the streets during those specific activities how these women used to live, their names and their personal stories. In the museum, everyone has to participate, including the director and the mayor, and because we think that museums, all of us are part of the museum community. This is an image from the last June. We have this tradition called marches in Portuguese, which are the celebration of the popular saints, and even the mayor participated. And so we have this work, and we want to keep going. This is an ethnographic march that we hosted last year, and everyone has a photo of the archive because we brought alive, we told the narratives of the people, memories that were lost in our archives. And we have this project called the Journeys of Sea Stories, and we ask people to share their personal stories, the stories about our maritime culture, and we share those stories on the streets. We have professional actors, and we have actors from the community as well, and everyone participates. And those journeys are for the celebration of the anniversary of the Maritime Museum, and it happens on our National Fishermen's Day, and that's a very emotional moment for us. At the museum, we don't ask only for people from the community to share their stories, but we ask to artists to share their perspectives about those stories and about the themes that are important for our community and for our society. This year at the Maritime Museum, we hosted for the first time an exhibition connecting with the narrative of queer people. We asked to we invited a Brazilian plastic artist called João Wagner Durich, and we had informal talks with our community, and that was really brilliant because we had stories about homosexual fishermen. They were really afraid of talk about this topic because it's very sensitive, and people actually talked. And so, as I told yesterday in the panel, in the debate, we are marking this year the 50 years of the end of our dictatorship. So we asked the women from Sesimbra to share their personal stories, and they start at the museum telling something like, oh, in the old times, it was really good because young people were more respectful, and then they start in that safe environment of the museum, start talking. And they share really sad stories about sex abuse, about being forced to marry to a man that they hated. And they are discussed about stories about being not being allowed for their parents to study, to being poor, to pass for really difficult times. And so we asked them permission for share the stories in the streets. This was the moment where everyone gathered, and we had more than 200 people participating at this specific show.
Fecho os olhos e tento encontrar-te no meio dos meus pensamentos.
Olha esse! Essa! Que manda mais esta não! Então eles que fizeram
Isto é para tu aprenderes a não escrever o que escreves.
Peço-vos que acreditem na liberdade e na nossa luta.
Viu?
Communities are the most important part of our heritage and of the collections and the narratives we have to preserve and to live for the people that are coming ahead of us. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. And our final speaker for this is Laura Williams-Boon, and she's Lloyd's Register Foundation Senior Curator, Contemporary Maritime at the Royal Museums Greenwich and Chair of the ICMM Ocean Sustainability Committee with over 15 years in museum and education sectors. Her mission is to promote public awareness and the understanding of the connectedness between maritime history and contemporary museum issues. And today, she explores the challenges of engaging audiences with contemporary topics. Laura.
Thank you.
Oh, there you are.
Hiding. Thank you. I feel humbled following up on so many incredible projects. And as maritime museums, we are gaining confidence and experience in dealing with difficult and contested histories. However, are we ready to engage with the challenges of the present and the future? As the final talk, I'll take the liberty of posing more questions than I can currently answer. in a time of climate emergency and misinformation, in order to be authentic, relevant, and useful to our communities, do we have to fundamentally change our ways of working? So traditionally, I'm actually using this microphone rather than this one at the moment. Traditionally, museums have seen themselves as places of expertise. They've been broadcasting houses. And over time, this has definitely changed. And so we've got the kind of more traditional definition of a museum here. And in recognition of the change over kind of the previous decades, ICOM in 2019 made the attempt in order to kind of reevaluate the definition of what a museum it is. Spoiler alert, it didn't go well. However, I think the definition that didn't get through is incredibly interesting and incredibly ambitious. Over this week, we've had lots of talk and discussion about the potential of the kind of so-called campaigning museum, and whether as maritime museums we should be and could be moving into this space. The New York Times kind of reflected on this kind of discussion within ICOM as museums having an identity crisis. Within museum professionals, there was an uneasiness about whether this was kind of the area that we all wanted or could move into. The resulting definition is perhaps a little less radical, but it's still definitely moving into this idea of the participation of communities. So we no longer have this museum expert voice. Instead, we have the sharing of ideas, the recognition of source communities, and those with lived experience. However, instead of museums really kind of leading change and perhaps suggesting how we could improve the lives of our communities, instead there's this slightly weaker, I would argue, reflection. And at the very heart of this move towards the participation museum, and you might want to reflect as to where your personal practice is or that of your museum is, there's this very idea of relevance. And we've heard mention of it today and in the last week. So Nina Simon gives the quite simple definition of relevance as relevance is a key that unlocks meaning. It opens doors to experiences that matter to us, surprises us, and brings values to our lives. And for me, there's two really key words in there. The first is value. We're adding something. But also surprise. I think sometimes when we think of relevance and in kind of representing communities, we start to use things like people being seen, them seeing that their personal experiences are shown within the museum space. And although this is really important, if we're wanting to have relevance, we need to be kind of adding. Sperber and Wilson, who first proposed this idea of museum relevance as early as 1986, actually gave it 2 criteria. So the first is that it has to have a positive cognitive effect. So through being in that space, you yield conclusions that matter to you. And then the second element is actually quite interesting. They also saw a negative correlation between the amount of effort that that person had to put in and the kind of the effort that you had to take in order to absorb that new information. And this is really important for museums. We've had lots of talk this week about barriers, both invisible and visible, to people accessing our collections and our stories. It sets the challenge to us that if we're wanting to have relevance, we need to, first of all, remove these barriers. So what could relevance mean within a museum context? Lots of us here will know that somewhere hidden in our museum, we have a small section about cruise ships. And often we're reflecting either these kind of glamorous ocean liners, this very inaccessible form of travel to most people, but beautiful images. Or this kind of funner post-war, Rotterdam Museum referred to it as fun palaces, which I think is delightful, and I'm going to steal. But perhaps to a modern audience, we begin to see cruise ships slightly differently. The slightly unkind phrase of newlywed, overfed, or nearly dead to describe the cruise ship passenger may spring to mind. So we're trying to look at this topic as something of relevance. How can we add this value? How can we surprise our audiences? And actually, there's been a huge change in cruise ship travel. As you can see on the graph, in the last 30 years, there's been an explosion. There's suddenly hugely higher numbers of passengers traveling on cruise ships. But we've also had a lowering of the age. So actually, for the first time this year, they estimate that the average cruise ship passenger is now under the age of 40. If you spend any time on social media, you'll see lots and lots of videos of influencers that have been paid to travel on cruise ships, as well as the entertainers themselves, showing it as this really fun, accessible thing for families. And does this present an opportunity for us? When we're increasingly living in a society where less and less people go to sea for work, actually, are these cruise ship passengers our new engaged audience? I'd say no. If we begin to think back to the idea of relevance, where can we add value? Where can we surprise? Do we have anything to add from the narrative that they can't get from TikTok? The much more challenging area of narrative is actually around the impact that these cruise ships are increasingly having on communities. In 2022, at Royal Museums Greenwich, we produced the exhibition Canaletto, Venice Revisited. So Canaletto artwork appeals to our most traditional museum of audience. It's a very traditional fine art exhibition. However, at the end, I was tasked with, let's look at the relevance. Let's add in, as we often do at the end of the exhibition, can we look at Venice today? Can we make this relevant and contemporary? And very quickly, we were able to work with activists and academics in Venice, as well as residents, to tell their story. No Grandi Navi, which is a campaign which basically means no big ships, has been active in Venice for over 15 years and often is held up as an example of communities really activating together from all different walks of life to challenge the impact that cruise ships, but also mass tourism, is having on their communities. Surprisingly, generally our audiences responded really well to this, but I'd argue that actually the narrative that Venice is being route-ruined by tourists has been around for several centuries. It is part of the narrative. Much more challenging for the museum, a maritime museum, where we every year host visitors from cruise ships, perhaps less than some of you guys here, to whom they're quite a significant audience, but also receive money from the cruise ship industry, is how to engage with our current communities, and increasingly in Greenwich, them saying that actually they don't welcome the cruise ships. And this is often led by very legitimate concerns around noise pollution, as well as air pollution. On the screen, you can see the graph that shows in the major ports that are receiving cruise ships. Actually, the cruise ships are causing more air pollution than all the cars put together in these areas. Interestingly, Venice isn't on that graph anymore. And that's because when these calculations were made, at that point, the cruise ships had been banned from Venice. I think this raises a really interesting question for museums. What role do we have to play in these debates? We often see ourselves in these contemporary issues as being the convening platform. We bring together our communities and we bring together our experts. As a maritime museum, are we ready to support our communities in their campaigns against ships? And what does that look like? With the help of my colleague Amy, who many of you will have met this week, we've actually been collecting the campaigning materials around both No Grandi Navi and also a smaller local campaign in London against Ocean Diva, a kind of party ship. However, this is just the beginning, and even within my organization, I've had feedback of, yes, but you need to collect both sides of the story. You just keep on collecting things that are anti-cruise ship. I find this really interesting and quite challenging. What does that mean? We've also collected materials from the unions that are talking about better rights for cruise ship workers following a mass firing. But there's sometimes this unease, this discomfort. We feel a loyalty to the maritime industry. Are we ready to speak out and call them out when their actions do not fit within a sustainable future? And I think more generally, I'll often talk about the importance of addressing sea blindness within our institutions, and I genuinely believe that this is incredibly important. But just like claims of greenwashing, where environmental organizations have been used to kind of almost apologize for the actions of large conglomerates, as maritime museums, are we at risk of performing sea washing, to create a new term? Not quite happy with it yet. But if we're thinking about this kind of participatory model where we're sharing information, as museums, do we also have the responsibility to call out the Maritime Museum for their lack of action? Yes, there's some really interesting work being done in the space of decarbonisation, but is it enough? We know that actually the maritime industry is one of the most polluting industries in the world. It's not included in the Paris agreements around climate change, and it's self-set and imposed kind of aspirations for meeting the climate crisis are both being missed, but also are not ambitious enough. As maritime museums, are we ready to say that there should be less ships? So curators in the UK, but I think this is a global thing, are often identified as one of the most trustworthy professions. We're always up there in the top kind of 5. And museums often fall into this fallacy of feeling that they're neutral. Earlier this week, we had the conversation around, can museums have opinions within the contemporary space? And I would strongly argue that, yes, we have to, and we always have. As long as they're fact-based, it's really important that we are willing to make a stance and be having these difficult conversations. There's been lots of research around the idea of museums telling half-truths. And as museum professionals, we can be really uncomfortable with this. A 2023-24 fellow, Yasmin Carr, has just undertaken a really interesting project called the Museum of Truth and Lies, and produced a really exciting podcast, which I definitely recommend to you. And in this, she explores to what extent museums lapse into telling half-truths by leaving out key information and concealing what is missing. On the screen here, you can see the kind of problem tree, and this is available as a toolkit. And I really recommend that as museums, we begin to think about how did we get where we are, and kind of what limitations is this placing on us. There's no surprises in there. As we often know, there's things like the very way that our organizations were funded and founded, but also our lack of a diverse workforce. If we're to be truly relevant and engage with these important contemporary topics, we need to be really self-critical of ourselves as organizations. Sometimes when first engaging with contemporary topics, it's easy to go with the very visible. And I'm pretty sure that most of us here at some point will have been involved in programming or an exhibition around ocean plastics. The Chicago Science Museum have run a long-term exhibition called the Blue Paradox, in which they state that plastics are an essential part of our lives, but threaten the ocean we rely on for our very survival. And this is true, but whenever we're working on these topics, it puts us in an uncomfortable spot. Every World Oceans Day, I get an email from our retail team being like, what can we sell in the gift shop linked to World Oceans Day? Museums are intrinsically unsustainable. Are we facing the issue of a museum paradox? We're wanting to get bigger. We're wanting these exciting capital projects. We're always wanting to do more. Actually, should we be taking, for once, from the maritime industry that's been promoting the idea of slow shipping? By just slowing down your ships, by being more thoughtful, you're still getting to your destination. You're still fulfilling your mission, but actually you're able to do it in a much more sustainable way. And this week we've seen some really exciting examples here in Netherlands where they've been rethinking really fundamental museum things like the touring exhibition. In terms of relevance, we also have to acknowledge that we can't be relevant to everyone at all times. To give an example of a reinterpretation project that we're currently looking at, we have the binnacle of the Rainbow Warrior here on the screen. This was acquired by the museum in the late 1980s, was on display for a few years, and has been off display for kind of over a decade. Interestingly, from the label, it took a very maritime museum stance. Nearly half of the label explains the type of binnacle it is, which is an interesting take. But actually, kind of hidden in this text is that this is an incredible, powerful object. To quickly kind of tell you about the story for those that are unaware, on the 10th of June 1985, the Greenpeace ship, the Rainbow Warrior, was the victim of an act of terrorism sponsored by the French government. One of the activists on board, Fernando Piera, whose photographs you can see on the screen, these are some of the last photographs he took before he was murdered, was blown up and he was killed. This isn't really something that the museum's properly engaged with, and it was really interesting talking to Greenpeace about a completely different issue. And we just mentioned, oh yeah, we've got your binnacle. and they were unaware of this. For them, this is this really touchstone moment for them as an organization. They went from being a very small grassroots organization to kind of a well-known international figure in the conservation movement that we know today. However, when we look at reinterpreting it, we really need to ask about who do we want to be most relevant for. Yes, it's important that we tell the story of Greenpeace and this act of terrorism, but we also need to ask, well, why was Greenpeace there in the first place? Something that's often left out of the story is that they were actually involved in the relocation of 300 Marshall Islanders from the Rongelap Atoll, which was still suffering from radioactive fallout from nuclear testing by the US government. For decades afterwards, the islanders asked and pleaded to the US government to relocate them. They had high levels of miscarriage and birth deformalities. In desperation, they reached out to a small environmental organization, Greenpeace, and asked them to relocate them. So when we think about environmental and maritime refugees, surely these are the types of stories that we should be telling through our collection. And I'm really excited to be starting to work with our Pacific Advisory Group to look at how they would like this story to be told within our organization. But if we think back to our problem tree, it's really interesting talking to some of my colleagues that have joined us from the British Museum, because suddenly they were like, are we allowed to talk to Greenpeace? Despite it being in our collection and us having an on and off relationship with them as an organization for pretty much their founding days. And I think this is really interesting, this idea of self-censorship. The museum has never said that there's these issues, but people have internalized. For those of you that are unaware, Greenpeace and the British Museum have been at loggerheads for a number of years, and Greenpeace regularly kind of protests and occupy them due to oil sponsorship of their spaces. And the question was asked as well at the very beginning of the conference, should we engage with Extinction Rebellion? I would say a very, very strong yes. We have objects from them in our collection. And I think when we think about who are our communities, who are our sea people, campaigners are a really important part of this. It's really easy to other them, to see them as somehow these scary people. And when we first worked with them in 2019, the main piece of feedback I got from my slightly terrified front of house around hosting them was, they're really nice. Because there'd been so much othering of them in the press. And for me, working with organizations like that is fairly simple. I don't necessarily fully agree with some of their methods, but fundamentally I agree with their values. And I'd say generally their actions are born out of love and hope. They're wanting to build a better world. There is fear there, they see what's coming, but fundamentally it's a movement of love. Much more challenging for us is actually how do we engage with those campaigners that are likewise driven by fear, but that has transpired into hate. This summer, this summer, the UK has seen some of its worst kind of riots and violence driven around fears around migration. And lots of museums in the UK quite rightly stood up and said, this is unacceptable. We need to be kind of supporting our migrant communities and really kind of preaching that multiculturalism brings a huge amount of value to the UK, which is completely true. However, by always taking this stance, it means as museums we're unable to actually have those interesting discussions. We know that the far right thrives through people being disenfranchised, from feeling that they're not able to have these discussions. I'm currently setting myself a challenge, and I currently don't know the answer, is actually how do we collect around the campaigns around kind of stop the boats and the anti-maritime refugee rhetoric. As one very last point of the conference, I'd like to take from conservation biology, which is my academic background. So I don't think he's as well known outside the UK, but think of an ex-punk David Attenborough vegan who's quite sweary, and we have Chris Packham. And to try and get people talking about the idea of kind of conservation priorities, he'd said, I'd eat the last panda if I could have the money we've spent on panda conservation back on the table to do more sensible things with. He was obviously being provocative. He's a vegan. I don't think he's going to eat the pandas. But I think with conservation and maritime museums and heritage, there's quite strong parallels. We're often motivated by emotion. And this means that setting priorities is often left behind. We all know that there's a limit to the amount of capacity that we have, be that space, money, staff resource. We need to be having these discussions about these difficult topics. What can't we do as much as what can we do? What have we always been doing for decades as museums? Because that's what we do. Is now the time for that critical analysis of what is our museum panda. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Laura. And I do hope our participants will accept my apology. We're running a bit late to do questions, and we need to move into our next session, and we've still got a tea break. So I just wanted to thank our fabulous participants and say what a wonderful opportunity it is to end on such an inspiring idea of the identity crisis of museums and the narrative, the idea of giving visitors a voice, whether it's through sea stories, whether it's through community, whether it's our role in relevance and our role in triggering debate. I will say, as somebody who's worked very extensively in giving visitors voice and in participatory experiences, and I'll just leave you one thought, you often do get some very interesting comments. The two that really have struck with me was we were talking about your voice matters and asking visitors to give us what they thought their voice, what they wanted to say. And it was a wall, honestly, half the size of this, and somebody had written across it, "My voice doesn't matter," which was a really important thing to stop and actually say, okay, we've got a whole group of people who feel totally disenfranchised. The other thing, again, in the context of what do you collect and when is it relevant and is it contemporary or not contemporary, we had an exhibition on free speech, and we had handed out a group of speech bubbles for people to write whatever they wanted on it. And this was at the time of marriage equality, and somebody had written, as a gay person, marriage is as important to me as anyone else. And it was blown up and hung up, and the following morning we came by and found that someone had deliberately punctured the balloon, and it was no longer, floating, it was actually flat. And then the conversation became, what do you do with it? Do you re-blow it up and patch it up and put it up there, or do you keep it as an object in its? And so we actually kept it as an object, put it on display, and added it to our collection. But those are the sorts of things that you continually have to be thinking through along the way as you engage with those conversations with our visitors and with our audiences. Thank you to our wonderful presenters, Peter, Laura, and Andrea. And